guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome to this Late Night Technique Tuesdays. If you are new here, my name is Heather, or the Sassy Cinderella. Normally I do lots and lots of Disney content, so if you are a Disney fan like me, stick around, hit the subscribe button, and turn on those notification bells so you don't miss any future content. I do have a long history with cake decorating, cookie decorating, so I have started incorporating that into the channel in a series called Disney Decorating. So I will be doing Disney inspired decorating tutorials that I'm really excited about, but I'm also doing these Technique Tuesdays as often as possible so that I can give you guys the tools and sort of the backstory to certain techniques so that you can jump right into those tutorials as they launch. So today we are actually going to be talking about how to properly crumb coat a cake. I know a lot of you are probably thinking, what the heck is a crumb coat? I had never heard of it either when I got new into the decorating just arena, but what a crumb coat is basically a first layer of icing your cake that's going to lock all the crumbs into place. So whenever you see those perfectly smooth buttercream cakes, it's actually a two-step process. First, you're going to coat with the nice thin crumb coat layer so that you kind of lock those crumbs down, and then later on go back with a second coat. So it's actually kind of a little bit deceiving that you have a two-step process. So we're going to talk about the first part of that process, which is the crumb coat. Now, I do a crumb coat whether I'm doing a buttercream cake or a fondant cake. With fondant cakes, I only use a crumb coat. So I'm only using that first thin layer and then covering with the fondant. That'll also help keep the fondant from having just sort of weird bumpiness and lumpiness to it, from having too much icing on the cake. And I really use the middle of my cake to fill it so that all of that icing flavor is in the center versus the outside when I am working on a fondant cake. Now, in saying that, you can also tort a cake, meaning you can split the layers so that you have more room for more and more icing or fillings or whatever you'd like to use. But for today's purposes, I am just using two separate levels to make one cake. Okay guys, so I want to give you a quick tip. I know that it can be really hard when you have that first initial icing of the cake. So something I like to do is I will actually freeze my cakes. So you can see here my second layer is wrapped with plastic wrap on a cake circle, and I've actually had it frozen overnight. This first layer was frozen as well. You certainly don't have to do this, but it does make the process easier. If you are, however, working with fondant, I would highly recommend that once you get your crumb coat completed, you really let the cake set for a while so that it comes back to more of a room temperature, because sometimes what happens, the only downside to that process is that the condensation from the cold cake starts to seep out, and sometimes you can get bubbles in your fondant. So if you are going to use a frozen cake to make the crumb coating process easier, just keep in mind that don't go ahead and cover the cake right away. You can, but you might run into that problem. So if you see that happen, that could be why. Fondant is just very sensitive in general to temperatures too. We will get into that later, but I would never want to cover in like a super hot environment if I could help it. So little things to just keep in mind. For today's purposes, we are just focusing on this crumb coat though. I'm going to go ahead and start off by using a Buttercream by CK. You can certainly make your own as well, and a crumb coat can be done really with any kind of buttercream. So you could do a Swiss meringue, you can do, this is like a heavy Crisco and, you know, sugar base, so it's going to be really thick. This kind of a buttercream is going to crust over. So this is going to allow eventually, if you do the two-step process, to have a very polished, pretty, perfect looking buttercream cake. However, you could not get that crusting on other types of icing, so just keep that in mind as well. Again, another thing we will get into later. So this icing is a very, very thick icing. It's much thicker than my homemade buttercream. So I actually went ahead and I added a little bit of water. You don't want to go crazy with this, but I thinned it out just a little bit. The thinner it gets, the longer it's going to take for your crumb coat to actually set. So I wouldn't recommend going too crazy with this. As you can see, I have the first layer of cake on my cake circle. I didn't do any kind of leveling or anything. They came out pretty darn flat. You might have heard me mention on my pro tips, which I put up on Instagram, so if you're not following me there, go check that out. Right here, I will leave the Instagram name. But I did mention in that video how something you can do to make your cake more level right off the bat is actually heat up your ingredients that you're putting into your cake mixture. So heating up your water, starting with an oil that's a little bit hot. You don't have to go crazy heating it, but just, you know, giving it a few seconds in the microwave and having room temperature eggs. If you start with a warm batter, it doesn't have to work as hard to meet the temperature in the oven, so it causes a more even rise and fall, and you get a nice level cake right off the bat. So today, I haven't done any of that leveling. If I were doing this for a client, I probably would still take the top layer and make it like absolutely perfect and flawless. But for today, this worked out really well. So you can see I have my first layer on this cake circle. I want to show you as well, something that's going to really help the icing process be easier is really getting a good turntable. I always tell people, if I could tell you to invest in one piece of equipment that might be a little on the pricier side, is a really good turntable. I really like the stainless steel tables, and I love this one that I have because they're nice and heavy, so they have a nice solid spin to them, which is really beneficial when you're doing any kind of icing process. This one is so great because the top of it turns, but when I flip it over, technical difficulties. I also have this half sheet that turns, so it's pretty nifty. I absolutely love this one. I believe it's made by Atco, which is A-T-E-C-O, I believe. It's been so long since I bought it, but I absolutely adore this turntable. It is a lifesaver. So back to our cake. We're going to talk about our crumb coat now. So I have watered down the buttercream a little bit. I am using an angled spatula. You can use a straight edge as well. I just like having a little bit of lift away from my cake so that I don't feel like my hand is right on top of the icing. You will notice that most of these have a little groove there that your finger's supposed to go here. I usually end up with mine down a little bit further as I'm working, but just so you know. So we're gonna kind of talk about icing technique here a little bit. Okay guys, so I had realized while filming that I actually had already sort of pre-done a step. So I wanted to make sure that that got included for you guys because it's a very important step. So if you did choose to freeze your cakes overnight on a board with plastic wrap, that's absolutely wonderful and it's really gonna help. But what I would do is just kind of gently with a spatula, sort of assist that cake back off and maybe start with a new board. I would recommend having a few of these on hand because we want a nice clean board to start on. And I'm gonna start off with a little bit of buttercream to the back side of a spatula. And in the center of my cake board, I'm just gonna kind of rub on a buttercream dot. My cat says hi. And take my layer of cake and actually press it into place, giving it a good amount of force to adhere to the board, so that way it doesn't slide around on you as you are icing the cake, and then you can move on to the rest of the crumb coat. I am going to start off, and I'm going to take a good amount of icing. You can see it's quite a bit, right to the center of my cake. So you see I've got my spatula down here and you see the icing is acting as a buffer between the cake and my spatula. Right now I have it completely flat. I'm going to give it just a slight angle and a fair amount of pressure, and I'm going to have the sweeping motion side to side. I'm using my turntable to my advantage to turn as I work the icing from the center out. And as I do this, one mistake I see a lot of people run into is they want to lift away from the cake when they need more icing, but that's going to pull the cake with you. So when you're ready for more, you're going to notice I'm just going to glide off. Don't try to lift away from the cake. If you get any crumbs on the side, you can use either a paper towel or a little bowl to kind of scrape off the excess. Okay, so I've grabbed another set of icing here, another big blob, and I have set it in the center and started the process again. Since I did not torch the cakes or split the layers to have multiple layers of icing, I am gonna go a little bit thicker on this cake here. Today we have lemon cake, which is one of my absolute favorites, so trust and believe this is probably gonna get eaten in my house. And we're just gonna glide off. This doesn't have to look perfect or pretty. I'm leaving it just as is because we are gonna be covering it with the next layer anyway. Okay, so now I have gone ahead and I have unwrapped the next layer of cake, and I am going to actually use the top as the bottom. Set it on top here. And if you have any plastic wrap or something handy, just to prevent your hands from like pulling that coating off, sometimes I like to use some plastic wrap, and I'm really gonna give it a good push into place. As I was mentioning earlier, if you were going to work with a fondant cake later, another thing that can happen is air can get trapped between the layers, which will bubble out into your fondant as well. It can even really happen with the buttercream if you don't let the cake set for a little bit, and they're never as sensitive as you think they are, so don't be kind of afraid to like tell them where to go, tell them, you know, who the boss is here. So yeah, don't be afraid to apply a good amount of pressure. Now that this looks nice and pretty and even, we're gonna talk about icing the sides of the cake. You can start on the top if you want, but I find for me that it's easier to work from the sides to the top because some of the icing sort of forces its way to the top as I'm working on the sides, so it's just my preference, but feel free to play around with this however you like. So I went ahead and I grabbed my mixing bowl. This is going to act as a place to put any of the dirty buttercream that I'm gonna have. And by dirty, I mean anything that has crumbs in it, because we don't want to carry crummy icing into the top or anything later. I mean, it is a crumb coat, so it's okay, but that dryness is going to make it harder and harder to stick. So as I'm working, you're gonna see me continuously like cleaning my spatula off to prevent just from pulling away from the cake. Again, that dry and dry from the cake isn't gonna wanna stick together. It's the buttercream that's gonna wanna stick to the cake. So you don't wanna let this get too out of control or you're gonna see a lot of problems. So to do the sides, again, don't be afraid to use a lot of icing. I'm gonna start off with a nice big glob, and I like to make sure that I have enough icing from top to bottom that it's gonna cover the height of my cake. So this is a really, really tall one today, but I'm gonna start right on the side. I have it straight against the cake. Remember, the icing is your buffer. You're not trying to press through to the cake. You want to use the pressure on top of the icing. So I'm going to start by sweeping side to side in rocking motions. Stuff's gonna fall off, it's going to happen, it's okay. You can already see that I have a lot of mess on the spatula, so I'm gonna go ahead and clean that off, and I'm gonna start again. Straight up and down to the cake, I'm using the pressure on top of the icing versus on top of the cake. And I'm just rocking side to side. Now my angle with the spatula, if you're looking at it like this, it's just a very slight angle. Don't come way over here or you're gonna actually drag into the cake. Very, very subtle rocking motion. Next big glob, same thing. Spreading it around, and I'm just working my way around. I don't stay in any one place too long. That can cause a lot of unnecessary friction in that spot as well, and there's just no need for that. Okay, so as you can see, I'm pretty covered, but I did sort of miss part of the top. This is a really tall cake today, so I'm gonna kind of take a little bit and go back over that now. I sort of started it on the top and pushed it down to the side so I can work right over top of that icing. Okay, so now I basically have the sides done. We are not going for perfection here. Let me tell you, if there are crumbs, that is okay. That is the point of this layer. Get the crumbs out of the way now. So don't stress out if you see crumbs. One other thing I do want to let you know though is if you are using a traditional American style buttercream with that really heavy shortening and sugar base to it, you want to work kind of quickly because the job of this icing is to harden up. So don't feel like you have to take too much time making it perfect. As that icing dries, it's going to get harder and harder for you to do. So now that I've got the sides done, and you can see how much I actually used on the top to get the top of the sides, and that's why I like to do the sides first. So I'm going to take another big glob to the top and do this the same way we did the center of the cake, working from the center out. Once I have the top covered, you will see me take the edge of the spatula and start to turn the turntable and pull inward, just to take off any unnecessary excess, because again, we generally want this to be a very nice thin layer. And because I'm a perfectionist, you will see me go back around the sides very gently with very light pressure, just to again kind of pull off any excess that I might have that I don't want. This is supposed to be a very thin layer of icing, and I like to just thin it down a little bit. Okay, and once that is done to my liking, I like to take a paper towel because you're gonna see some of that buttercream is gonna collect down on the board. And I just like to clean that up a little bit. Okay guys, so this is our crumb coat. You can see it's not perfect, but it definitely is going to do the job we need for the next step, whether that be buttercream or it be fondant. Or even, you know, if you get into using modeling chocolate or something like that. Now, I will say there are other tools if you really want to make things look perfect that you're welcome to use, like a bowl scraper or bench scraper. to the size of the cake. You can actually get your spatula in some hot water and kind of shake it off, and that'll really smooth things out as well. And there's another little trick of magic I will show you one of these days, probably on a pro tip on the Instagram page. All right guys, so here is one last look at our crumb coated cake. Now for the next step, you would either be going onto a second coat of buttercream or potentially fondant. And just keep in mind, I would wipe your spatula clean if you're going to be using the same spatula going into another layer of buttercream, because you don't want to have any of that dry buttercream or the crumbs on your spatula. So just keep that in mind. If you guys ever have any questions at all, by all means, leave them down in the comments. I would love to chat cakes with you. I really hope this was helpful. I hope the spatula technique and the icing technique was helpful, because I know that sometimes that can be a little daunting, and it definitely will get easier with time. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. And I can't wait to see you guys in the next one. Have a great day. Bye.